Today we have an interesting talk for you. A person whose family have been in Quakers longer, I think, than most of us. Therefore, sit back and enjoy an interesting hour where Roger talks about his family. Roger.
Thank you. Right. Well, I'm going to go straight to share screen and see if I can get a photograph up. Now, where are we? How do I go about this? Files. That's what I want. No, don't think that's going to work without. Right. No, let's forget about that. Let's go.
You managed to start screen sharing.
I did, but it's finding my files. It's the problem. It's because I don't work in Word and Microsoft, so it's all gone crazy. So let's see if I can get back to.
You can stop screen sharing, I think, by clicking.
Stop share. Here we are. There we are. That's it. Good. Okay. Right. Well, the key person, sort of at the center of the web, as it were, is the first Sturge to move into what is now Bristol. He actually only moved to Westbury-on-Trim because then it wasn't part of Bristol then, but more of that in a moment. His name was Jacob Sturge. And I'm going to go back from him first of all. Well, no, let's say a bit about him first. He died in 1811. He married in 1778. That gives you some idea of the timing we're talking about. And the place he moved into was Red House Farm in what is now Coombe Lane. I don't know, it may have been Coombe Lane then. And I suspect that he farmed the university playing fields as now. So if you know Coombe Lane, the Red House, it's just next to Red House Lane, behind a high stone wall. It has a Georgian facade, but behind the Georgian facade is a much earlier building, fascinating house, which I've been around. It's really very interesting. So anyway, this is Jacob. He married a woman called Mary Young. A woman called Player, and so he. He married a woman called Mary Young. His mother was a player, and her brother John Player had already diversified into land agent and surveying, and Jacob did that too with him. But we'll come back to that. But where did Jacob come from? Before he moved to Bristol, well, I say Bristol, as I say, it was actually Westbury-on-Trim. The Sturge family lived all over the area that really stretches, I suppose, from Yate to Aust and from Almondsbury to Thornbury. And they farmed in various different places. They were tenant farmers, but pretty prosperous. Some of you may remember a very nice restaurant called the Gaunts off Earthcote Manor Restaurant and Junk Shop, which is off to the east of the A38, not too far from it's on the way to the Memorial Woodlands burial ground. So that gives you some idea of where it is. It's just off the old Gloucester Road, which ran along the bottom rather than on the top for some reason. And that was certainly lived in by a man called Thomas Sturge at the beginning of the 17th century. And he then had a son called Joseph. He had a number of sons, but I'm going to concentrate on the Josephs because there were 4 of them in a row in this particular thing. The first 2 lived at Gaunts Earthcote, but Joseph III moved to Ulverston Court. Now, you probably don't know Ulverston Court, and I'm very disappointed I haven't got a photograph. I can't put up the photograph because it's a fascinating building. It started as a Saxon stockade, and when the Normans came, they made a curtain wall, and it was a sort of fortified manor house. And the moat is still there. Sorry, there are noises off. My son's downstairs talking rather loudly on the phone. The Ulverston Court again, they were tenants. At Gaunt-Surthcott, they were tenants of the Bristol Corporation. I don't know who owned Ulverston Court. It may be that they bought it. Maybe Joseph bought it. I don't know. Anyway, his son Joseph the Fourth was born there, and Joseph the Fourth lived there and had a large family. And that's the generation that Jacob occurs in. Jacob had two older brothers. One was called Thomas, who went to London and set up an oil importing business. Of course, it was whale and seal oil in those days. But his two sons really developed the business and made a pot of money on gravel extraction from the Thames estuary, and they got the license for Portland cement. So they did very well, and we'll come back to them in connection with the wealth that went down to the younger brother George as the last survivor of the firm. Joseph IV had quite a big family, but there are four of his children that are of particular interest because each founded one of the branches of the Sturge family. I mentioned Thomas, who had this business in London, and as I come back to him. Then there's Joseph V, who was the one in that generation, and he lived at Elberton Manor. And if you've ever driven around in the back lanes of that lovely area, but north of the M4, you may well have come across Elberton Manor, a fine building in the setback from the road, and he farmed there. But his sons spread over the world, and I think it was four of his sons moved to Birmingham, where they made quite a mark. Because one of the photos I'd like to have shown you is a statue of Joseph VI, which is in Five Ways in Birmingham. That's outside the hotel now, and on the Five Ways roundabout. It was a rather complicated junction, and it reflects his high standing in the city as an alderman, as one who developed a park for children from the city in Edgbaston, which upset his neighbours considerably. And he also is famous for two particular ventures. One is that he did a tour of the West Indies in the 1830s and reported on the working of the transitional scheme from slavery to freedom called the apprenticeship scheme. And as a result of his report, the apprenticeship transition was brought to an end a year early because it wasn't working. And there are a number of memorials to him in the West Indies. One is Sturge Town in Jamaica. I believe there's a statue of Joseph in Kingston. And he set up a plantation in Montserrat, or bought a plantation in Montserrat, which still belongs to the family, to employ freed slaves. And it was not just a plantation. They grew limes, and they had a lime juice producing factory, and that business is still in the Sturge family, in that branch of the Sturge family. And there's a big bunch of people descended from Joseph V. The other Nick Sturge, it was the supervisor for the restoration of the Big Ben Tower recently, working for McAlpin's. Anyway, more of that. So that's one of the big branches, which is known as the Birmingham branch, though, of course, quite a lot of them didn't live in Birmingham. Quite a lot of them lived in London. One of them was called Arthur Lloyd Sturge, the Lloyds being the banking family, because I think probably his mother or his grandmother was a Lloyd. But he's actually at the top of the list of the directors on the old entrance to Lloyd's of London, the insurers, because he was a big man in insurance. So they're quite interesting bunch of people, all sorts of interesting threads. But I won't spend any more time on them because they weren't in Bristol. Then, of course, there's Jacob, and I'll come back to him in a minute. But then there was a sister, Fanny. Now, you might ask, why do I call that a branch of the Sturge family? Well, she was a Sturge, and she had some very interesting descendants. She married a man called Joseph Clark, who lived in Street. That might be ringing some bells. Two of her sons, James and Cyrus, started a shoemaking business. That might ring bells too. Yeah. It's very interesting because she was the daughter, she was the sister of Jacob, which makes her descendants my fifth cousins. But in the next generation, James married one Eleanor Stevens, who was the half sister of the Sarah Stevens, who married Jacob's son, Jacob Player Sturge. So I'm also descended from the next generation down, their father, William Stevens. And so the present members of the Clark dynasty, who are associated with Redland Meeting, are my fourth cousins and my fifth cousins. There are also some Morlands who are my second cousins, my fourth cousins and my fifth cousins, but that's another matter. They're not in Bristol. I did know them, though. The four might well be known to you. They are Catupeda, who is a Clark. Her mother was a Clark. And Brevis Gillett and Candia Carolan were the children of Nicholas and Ruth Gillett, who are descended from the same stock. And finally, a more recent addition to Redland Meeting is Peter Openshaw. And those of you who followed the press conferences during COVID may well have encountered him as a nationally recognized virologist. But he come to Bristol because his wife is the Vice Chancellor of Bristol University, and so they live at Rolford House. So there's that connection as well. So there are four branches: the London branch, the Birmingham branch, the Clarks, Morlands, Openshaws, Clothiers, etc. And then, of course, there's the Bristol branch, which starts with Jacob. So let's go on from Jacob, but keep those four branches in your mind because they come into the story a bit later in one way or another. Some of them do anyway. The son of Jacob had a number of children. He had, let's see if I can remember. Make sure I get the right ones. I'm not expecting to refer to my notes very much. Yeah, let's talk very briefly about this land agent business, because Jacob's two sons, interestingly enough, called Young and Jacob Player. Young because his mother was Young, was the surname of his mother, which is quite common practice among Quakers, to use the mother's maiden name as the name of the eldest son. And one way of keeping the family name going. And interestingly enough, there have been Youngs in the firm since then. Not directly descended, of course, but related to Jacob Player Sturge's mother. Young was the older brother. He started the business in Bristol in about 1800, and his quite a bit younger brother, was only 7 at the time, but when he became of age, he joined his brother, walking the 3 miles from the Red House into Bristol every day to work. And they started, their original office was in Small Street on what's now the site of the Guildhall, the registry office now. And it moved around quite a bit, eventually ending up in Berkeley Square. And I was going to show you a photograph of one of the Georgian houses in Berkeley Square where their offices were, and then they moved to spanking new offices as they got bigger, up in the top right left-hand corner. But when they'd been going for 250 years, with a little help from me, they produced a history of the firm. And the next year they were taken over. They were bought out by an international, multinational organization called JLL, short for Jones Lang LaSalle. And so the big signs saying J.P. Sturge, or later King Sturge, disappeared from the streets of Bristol, which is rather sad. And they gave up the big office in Berkeley Square and have a little place in Great George Street. But anyway, that's the firm, and I will be mentioning them from time to time as we go along. But they stayed, that firm stayed in the family until the last Sturge was my grandfather, who retired in 1933, and the last of the family was his cousin Bill Goodbody, who died in about 1960 while still in office. More of him later. So that's the business side. Let's move on to the people. Young Sturge, Jacob Player Sturge is my ancestor, so I'm less interested in young Sturge, but he actually did have quite a number of offspring, including his, let's get this right. Yep. That none of them stayed in the family firm, but it became J.P. Sturge and Sons eventually, and I'll talk more in detail about them in a minute. But just to pick up the descendants of young Sturge, Young, interestingly enough, owned a house in Sea Mills, which is the site of a block of flats that I had a tenant in. And it was actually the development in the 1960s that produced those two blocks of flats was in fact J.P. Sturge. So it was, I only discovered that later, after I was already working there. But he then moved to Ulverston. And he lived in Hill House, the house where, I think he did, yes, I'm pretty sure he did. He lived in Hill House, the house where George Fox and Margaret Fell stayed during the period of their marriage in Bristol, just opposite Ulverston meeting houses, because in those days there were meeting houses all over that area. The only one of them surviving, of course, is Frenchay. And when there was only Frenchay, it merged with Bristol to become Bristol and Frenchay Monthly Meeting. And at that time, there was only one Bristol meeting in Friars, and that was the Bristol meeting, and it had sort of fairly high status because it was the only meeting in a major centre of Quakerism in Bristol, in England. In the 1840s, of course, the firm was very much involved in the railways, and in my lifetime, there's been a locomotive called Quaker Enterprise after particularly the Sturge involvement. Though the clerks also were responsible for railways. They were behind the development of the Slow and Dirty, the Somerset and Dorset Railway, to move their goods out to Burnham and to Bristol. And J.P. Sturge probably he certainly bought the land on behalf of Great Western Railway, of course, the Temple Meads, and he also surveyed and purchased land for the Bristol and Exeter Railway. If you go up the slope to Temple Meads on the right, there's a big grey building. At least I think it's still there. I think it may have been knocked down. I'm not sure. I can't keep up with what's happening at Temple Meads. I don't go there very often. And that was the headquarters of the Bristol and Exeter Railway, which connected Temple Meads to Exeter, of course, and had that quite difficult surveying job of taking the railway across the Somerset levels. Well, that's down to J.P. Sturge. He also received a letter, a prospectus from a committee headed by Telford for the construction of a suspension bridge across the Avon Gorge. And that's rather a precious piece of paper, and I'm not sure whether I've still got it. I put it on display at a Sturge family event in Frenchay, and I had a feeling it disappeared at that point, which is rather sad. But addressed to J.P. Sturge, Esquire. So young Sturge, J.P. Sturge, became quite big names in Bristol commercial life. They were, I believe, surveyors to the corporation. And when J.P. Sturge died, he was succeeded by with three of his four sons. He had four sons: William, Henry, Walter, and Robert. I'll deal with Walter and Robert first, because there's least to say about them. Walter was married but didn't have any children. In 1851, he produced a circular family tree of the Sturge family, which has now been extended by my son with the help, because it's been digitized by MJ, who's a member of Redland meeting. It's lovely. And so Nick has extended it on our branch of the family. So it's no longer circular, it's a little bit oblong. Robert, the youngest, lived in Pembroke Road, 101 Pembroke Road, and he had one son who died when he was 18 and 7 daughters. Now, those were the days when Quakers didn't marry out. And I think 4 or 5 of the daughters were married. 3 of them married three brothers Stevens. They're the same Stevens family cropping up again. And I've actually met descendants of that family. John Stevens was a friend of my father and did some interesting work in Germany during the war, between the wars. So they kept their Quaker connection. One of them married a tanner. I think Mary married a tanner. Now, whether that tanner was related to the Herbert Tanner that some of you may remember. Does anybody remember Herbert Tanner? No? Oh, Chris might do. He was the friend who, when in the days when the collection usually consisted of a few silver coins, always put a £1 note in the collection. He was pro-chancellor of Bristol University. He was a director of E&SA Robinson, the big Quaker. I'm not sure they were Quaker. The big stationery company in Bedminster. He was the High Sheriff of Bristol in 1930, I think. And his daughter married Oliver Franks, who later became Lord Franks. And Lord Franks is interesting. He's reckoned to have the record for how long one could be an attender before becoming a member, 80 years. He beat the previous holder of the record, a man called Lawrence Houseman, who some of you may know as a poet, who was an attender for 60 years and then joined Friends, which was interesting because he was also a very prominent humanist. So his Wikipedia entry is quite interesting. What brought him to Friends, I don't know, but I think he attended street meeting for a long time and then finally joined Friends. But whether Herbert Tanner is related to this family, I don't know. I'd have to get Nick to delve into his ancestry researches to find out whether there's a connection there. Right. So that's the two younger brothers. The second brother was my ancestor Henry, and he wasn't cut out to be a surveyor. And he was quite a lively, interesting character. Apparently, his father describes him coming into the room with a twinkle and a dance and so on. But he went to London and he worked. He was described as an oil man, so I think he almost certainly worked with Thomas and George, but his cousins. But I don't know. He married a woman called Elizabeth Dudley, who became a Quaker to marry him, so there wasn't a marrying out problem. And so I have a marriage certificate for him. Unfortunately, in 1848, she died when pregnant. He had no children from her, and she died. 8 years later, he married her sister. And in those days, that wasn't on. You weren't allowed to marry your deceased wife's sister. It was against the consanguinity rules. And so I also have a certificate of marriage, which is on a scrap of blue paper and is signed by the Burgermeister of Duisburg, because the law says that if you contract a marriage that's legal in another country, it's valid here. His sister, Sophia, Elizabeth's sister, Sophia, didn't convert to Quakerism. So their family seemed to have grown up in a mixed religion household, and we'll come back to that. But I want to move on to William, because he is of particular interest. William was the eldest son, and he took over as senior partner when his father died in 1856, and or was it 57? I'm not sure. The nice touch when Sturge's folded in were taken over in 2011, they got rid of all their archival material and some objets d'art, and one of them was a magnificent silver inkstand, which I was offered. I suggested it should go to one of William's descendants, because it was his item. He got it because it was a present from the tenants of the Dauncey estate in Wiltshire, where he'd been their steward. So he was obviously much appreciated by the tenants, who felt that this land agent was looking after them very well. Anyway, that was probably in the early 60s. But he became the senior partner, and he stayed that way for some time. He also wrote a bit on Quaker matters, and he'd already established himself as a very able surveyor and advisor, particularly effective as a witness in land court cases. And there's a quote from one leading barrister who said, "Cross-examining Mr. Sturge is a sign of inexperience." You didn't. If you were a lawyer who knew your stuff, you didn't dare cross-examine William Sturge, because he was so sharp, but also with quite a lot of humor, apparently. So William, his eldest daughter was born while they lived with the parents in Cotham Road. Highbury Villa is what's now Cotham Road. It used to be called New Road. But then they moved to 25 Somerset Street, which in Kingsdown, which is now the home of the Allport family. which is quite a nice connection. One of his daughters wrote a lovely little book called Some Little Quakers in Their Nursery, and it gives an account of all her brothers and sisters, all by their nicknames. Caroline, of course, was called Dot. Work that one out for yourselves. I'm not quite sure why Margaret was called Archie. But anyway, I can't remember all the others. But it's a lovely little book, and if you ever get a chance to read it, it's in the area meeting library, so well worth a read. Gives an idea of what it was like in the 1840s and 1840s and 50s to grow up as a Quaker child in Bristol. They still wore rather strange clothes and got laughed at in the street, that sort of thing, which was quite difficult for them. It was a big family. They had 4 sons and 7 daughters, but one of the sons and one of the daughters died in childhood. But the brothers are all of interest in one way and another. The eldest went to London and became a doctor. He was his name was Will. He not only was a doctor, but he married one of the pioneer women doctors called Emily Bovell. And he made his name as a neurologist and pathologist. And he described the neurological condition that's associated with the port wine stain birthmark. And a generation later, a scientist called Weber picked it up and very generously named it the Sturge-Weber syndrome. And you can look that up in the dictionary. The only Sturge that you'll actually find in the dictionary as opposed to the encyclopedia. Unfortunately, Emily seems to have contracted TB. It's only in the accounts. It only refers to a chest difficult. Had a weak chest. I've got good reason for thinking that it was probably TB, and so they spent a lot of their time in the south of France. He gave up the practice in London. He became sort of society doctor to the English community in Nice, including one Queen Victoria, who was quoted as referring to having visited the nice Dr. Sturge. When he retired, Emily died, sadly, and he married the woman who'd been helping to look after her, as a friend of hers, called Julia. They retired to Suffolk, where he became an antiquarian, and he ended up with 2 big collections, one of flint implements and one of Greek artifacts, vases and things. The flints are in the British Museum. There's the Sturge collection, and the vases are in Toronto. How they ended up there, I'm not sure. He would have bequeathed the flints to British Museum. So that's William. He had 3 younger brothers. I say one of them died. John, sadly, was eventually pressured by his father to join the company, but he hated it and ended up with I think probably an eating disorder. I'm not quite sure, but he was certainly not at all well. And eventually he persuaded his father that what he really wanted to do was go and study. And he went to London to study, I can't remember what, literature probably. But sadly he died within the first year at university. So John was a tragic case. The youngest brother, Clement, also went to London. He got his MA somewhere, became a lawyer and a journalist. And it's said, his sister Elizabeth claims that he advised the palace on the coronation arrangements for Edward VII because nobody could remember what happened at Queen Victoria's. It was, after all, quite a long time before. They didn't have a film of it, funnily enough. So, but whether that's true, I'm not sure. I think he was also a county councillor. Before I go on to the William's sisters, I want to mention his aunt, Will's sisters, the daughters of William and Charlotte Sturge. William's sister, Matilda, was a very respected friend in an elder in Bristol meeting, and in fact, late in life, gave actually one of the radical papers, modernist papers, at the Manchester Conference. So I was represented at the Manchester Conference by two relations. She was one of them, and the other was John William Graham, who was also one of the keynote speakers. So that's my maternal grandfather. But the daughters of William and Charlotte Sturge, the only one of them married, the one that was known as Archie, Margaret. She married a man called Goodbody, and I'll come back to her in a little while. But the eldest daughter was Emily, born in 1845, a really pretty remarkable woman, because in 1880 she was elected to the Bristol School Board. I think the only woman on the school board in the 1880s. Sadly, she died in a riding accident. Her horse bolted on Rownham Hill. If you know where Rownham Hill is, you'll know it's pretty steep and dangerous. And she fell and didn't recover, sadly. But she and two of her sisters were very closely involved with the establishment of Redland High School, so she had a strong interest in education. All five of those, the daughters that didn't marry, got very much involved in education, holding lectures and meetings and so on. I think they I can't remember, they actually managed to get Nansen to come and talk at one of their occasions. This was very much part of the sort of melting pot that led to the establishment of Bristol University. So they're fairly significant, interesting people. And you'll find some of them described in the book about women in Bristol called Go Home and Do the Washing. After Emily was Elizabeth. Elizabeth is very interesting, and she is the author of a book which gives us a lot of the information that I'm able to share with you. She wrote her reminiscences in 1926, and then gave a talk on the Sturges and early Quakerism at the first big Sturge family reunion in 1930. But she started off as a home daughter, but she got work at the Red Lodge. You know the Red Lodge in Park Row. It's now a museum, but in those days, it was being run as a reformatory school for difficult girls by a woman called Mary Carpenter. And Elizabeth got fully stuck into that. And I think when Mary Carpenter died, Elizabeth joined the team of managers that ran the place, until she then decided to go and work in London. Now, you've probably heard of Octavia Hill. Do you know why she's famous? What's Octavia Hill famous for? Give up?
Yeah.
National Trust. She was one of the founders of the National Trust, but she was also very much involved with social housing. And so Elizabeth worked with her on social housing for, I think, 5 or 6 years. I'm not quite sure how long, until her mother died. And then father said, "You've got to come home and look after me. I need 2 home daughters." He already had Helen, and Elizabeth had to come home and help, because the other daughters had gone off to other things. Charlotte, always known as Carter, studied philosophy at Cambridge. But of course, being a woman, wasn't presented with her MA until she was very near the end of her life in the early 1920s, and ended up as an anthroposophist. You know what that is. Then there was Helen that I mentioned. She was home daughter, and was very active Bristol Quaker. In the record, when we looked at the records set up for the 350th anniversary of Quakerism in Bristol, she was prominent as clerk of many of the signing quite a lot of the minutes that were on display. And she later became a Swarthmore lecturer on social welfare. And so had done quite a lot of work in social welfare in Bristol. Where we got to, and then the youngest, Caroline. Now this is where George comes in again. I hope you can remember who George was. I'm afraid I've been bombarding you with names. George was the younger of the two sons who followed their father Thomas into the oil, gravel, and cement business. He had married a member of my bit of the family called Jane. So there was a marriage of George Sturge and Jane Sturge. They were a generation apart. He was quite a bit older than her, I think. But the distance of relationship, if they'd been cousins of the same generation, they would have been disowned. Maybe they were anyway, I'm not sure. But they may not have been Quakers anymore. I really have no idea. But anyway, Caroline, the youngest, was studying studying in Bristol, but wanted to go to London and join her brother and train as a doctor. Father said, well, I'm not going to stop you, but I'm not going to pay. So she couldn't, because she couldn't afford it, until Aunt Jane died. When Aunt Jane died in 1883, George gave away, deed of gift, wait for it, £300,000. 1883, 10 billion in today's values, probably, at least. So he wasn't short of a bob or two. He lived in Sydenham in South London, an area I know quite well. And most of it went to all the London hospitals, who all got something between £500 and £5,000 each, which was, of course, quite a useful donation in those days. But I think it was 50 of his and Jane's younger relations got an annuity. All Jane's nieces and great nieces and nephews, for example, including my grandfather, got an annuity of £104 a year, £2 a week. And that was a sufficient competence for young Caroline, who dashed off to London and trained as a doctor, became quite successful as an obstetrician, and used to give lectures at the Royal Free on midwifery. So that was a good end to that story, but it has a sadder ending later. I think probably after she retired, she had a brain tumor and died. So those are the sisters. Elizabeth and Helen, as well as Emily, had been involved in Redland High, and some of you will have seen the plaque in Redland Road on the front of the old Redland High built estate land and wall around the end of their playing fields. A plaque to Emily and Elizabeth. But there's another plaque in Durham Park, which was where Elizabeth and Helen lived at the end of their life. Helen died in 1945, Elizabeth in 1944, quite a good age. She must have been well on in her 90s. So we got two. Elizabeth is unusual in having two blue plaques, both initiated by Redland High at different times. And I think that the people who initiated the second one had forgotten that they'd been involved with the first one. So I joined the then Lord Mayor in unveiling the one in Durham Park, though one of William's descendants, Sue Morgan, was present, and it should have been her, not me, because they were the children of William, not my particular branch. They were my cousins. And it was to Sue Morgan that I said Sturgis should give the silver inkstand, and she came over, and I think her husband is a retired admiral from Sherborne, and very happily received this silver inkstand, which I'm actually quite glad not to have. There we are. How are we doing? I must go quickly on to Henry's children. Henry had a big family, and there are only one or two of them I want to mention. One, of course, is my grandfather Theodore, who went into the firm with his uncle William. There's a letter from him. By that time, the family lived in Penzance. They had been living in Victoria Walk in Cottam, but they'd moved to Bristol Henry had moved to Bristol to sell chandeliers. He was an ornamental ironmonger, but he had a chandelier warehouse in Clare Street. In fact, he had two in succession, both gone. They both probably got bombed, sadly. So I can't identify them. There are buildings on the sites. I know just pretty well where they were. But I suspect that the bottom fell out of the chandelier market as town gas got more commonly used. That's my hunch, but I don't know for sure. So they moved to Penzance, where it was said that Henry engaged in bookselling, but I haven't been able to confirm that. That Elizabeth says that's what happened, but I don't know. But my grandfather travelled from Penzance and stayed overnight on his way to Birmingham with his cousins, who by that time were living in what's now Woodland Road. If you know the row of very fine houses along the north side of Woodland Road, the end one is actually in Tyndall's Park Avenue. I can't remember what the number is. That whole block has now been substantially developed by the university, and the house where the William and Charlotte and their children lived was the end house. My grandfather stayed there on his way to Birmingham, and there's a letter from him to his mother. When he was 16, he was going to Birmingham for an apprenticeship, but I have no idea what. But he was obviously very close to his cousins and uncle and aunt. And when William couldn't get any of his sons to go into business, and of course in those days there wasn't any question of the girls doing it, he recruited Theodore into the firm, and he worked in the firm. Was a fairly low-paid junior to start with, and he was quite hard up when my father was born in 1891. He'd married a member of the May family. She was actually May Gripper, but and she was always known as May as her first name. But her grandmother was her mother was a May, who were a big East Anglian Quaker dynasty. Bryant and May and Gurney, all those were Mays. But May had such a bad time when my father was born that she didn't have any more children. But in 1915, they adopted through Quaker channels, sort of one of these informal private adoptions, a baby called Richard Leonard, who became Richard Leonard Sturge. And some of you will have come across him as the very much respected music master at Saffron Walden, and a great choral conductor. They even did, I think they did the Dream of Gerontius in Friend's house once, which was quite a and anyway, that's a side issue. My grandfather had a number of brothers and sisters. Three of them stand out for me. One was Uncle Phil, who sounds to have been a great character. There's a lovely book that he's produced, handmade book of a very amusing account of a family visit to Weston-super-Mare with lots of illustrations. He went to India, and he taught at the Nizam College, very prestigious boys' school in Hyderabad. and eventually became its principal. But apparently he died of choking on a fishbone, which was very sad. And his wife was devastated, but he didn't have any children. But I'm in contact with the descendant of another brother, Howard, who his grandson David lives in is an engineer, and he now long retired, lives in Germany and not far from Dresden. They're just moving out from the countryside into Chemnitz. Where his wife is an art teacher, an artist. But one of the other grandsons married one Lady Helen Windsor in St George's Chapel, Windsor. She was the daughter of the Duke of Kent. The sister Marion married a man called Tregellis, and they lived in Barnstaple. They had two children, Geoffrey and Olga. Geoffrey came to Bristol and lived with my grandparents in Stoke Bishop, Sneyd Park, really, just off the Downs, and used to go to Clifton College as a day boy, like my father had just a bit before him. And then followed my father to Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. But in 1914, he hadn't finished his studies. He volunteered in the Devonshire Regiment, and and of course the junior officers in the First World War were particularly vulnerable. And he by July 1916, he was an acting captain. In July, 1st of July 1916, the beginning of the Somme offensive, and the Devons had a suicidal mission diagonally across the front line with a high ground on their right, and they were absolutely mown down, and Jeff was killed. So that he's quite an important person in our family. But Olga's son, also called Geoffrey, has recently got in touch with me, and I've got to know him a bit, and probably because of talking to me, and I've been to stay with them and doing Quaker things. He's dipping his toe in Quakerism again, which is quite nice. They go jumping 2 generations. I don't know how far that will go, but he's obviously enjoyed going to meeting from time to time. But Theodore, yes, as I say, Theodore joined the company. He eventually became the senior partner and retired in 1933. But he was also joined by one of Margaret Sturge's, Margaret Goodbody's sons, called Sturge Goodbody, funnily enough, after his mother's maiden name. And he was in the firm, and his son, Bill Goodbody, succeeded my grandfather as the senior partner until he died in 1960. But his Bill's sister, Margaret, I'll tell you a nice little story about her, and I think we're getting to the point of winding up. When Hilda and I were coming to Bristol, I was working in a tire factory, I think, or I think I'd finished my finals. But Hilda came down to Bristol to house hunt, and she bumped into one of her lecturers in Park Street, Miss Goodbody. Of course, neither of them knew that they were now related. She was quite a character. I gather she wasn't too brilliant as a teacher, but she's written a fascinating book about the 5 sisters in search of learning, and also a book about a Bristolian in Nazi Germany, because she did all her studies in Germany. She was a German lecturer. And she went to school in Germany at one point for a short time, and then did her first degree, and then her PhD all in Germany. So there's a very, very interesting account of the life of a student in Germany in the Nazi period, which of course I'm studying, and I've found the book very, very interesting. My father didn't stay in the firm. In 1914, well, in 1915, he was in the FAU, the Friends Ambulance Unit, driving ambulances at Ypres. But in 1916, came home. He'd been very active in adult school and scouts before the war, and his father had taught him to drive, so he was able to drive ambulances quite quickly. He was friendly with the two Catchpole brothers, and later helped Jack Catchpole in the founding of the YHA, and became the secretary of the Southwest region of the YHA. When in 1916 he was given conditional exemption from military service, he didn't feel able to go back to France because of the increasingly dependence on integration with the military, and that was true of quite a number of young men. Corder Catchpole, for example, was an absolutist. I don't know that he even went to a tribunal. He was imprisoned for 6 months at a time. He'd come to the end of his 6 months, told to put on uniform, would refuse, would go to prison again for 6 months, and he didn't come out of prison until 1919. My father, on the other hand, was given conditional exemption, and he worked for what was called the German Emergency Committee, which was to provide relief for distressed aliens. I think he probably worked at the internment camp at Alexandra Palace, because somebody who's researched a woman he met there, and whom he subsequently married, said that's where she worked. So I'm assuming that he did, but I don't know that for sure. He was still in the FAU, but he was seconded to the work at Alexandra Palace. And he married this woman, Lucy Thompson, in 1918, but in 1919, the continuing flu epidemic, sadly, they were both hit by it. He just about recovered, and she didn't, and she died. And I have her will, and it's witnessed by my wife's great aunt. And I made an assumption based on the fact that she was one of the witnesses, that she was pregnant, and that's been confirmed. She was. In fact, she was pregnant, and they didn't have a house. So my grandparents were very upset, particularly my grandmother. And my father actually fell out with his parents for quite a period. Don't think I talked to each other for 2 years. And of course, that meant he didn't go back into the surveying business. But he did go to Germany to run one of the American-funded feeding schemes for children in Germany, because of the great famine that there was, thanks to the blockade. But I think that I won't take you any further than that, except to say that he came back from there. Crofton Gain recruited him to be the first warden of a new institution that Crofton had set up. Crofton was a Bristol Quaker furniture maker, quite well known. And he persuaded my father to be the first warden of the Bristol Folk House, some of which some of you will know it, but it wasn't where it is now. It was where the extension of the public library is, the central library. It was on College Green. And they had 4 children in Bristol, the first in Berkeley Square, the 4 in Goldney Avenue. And then my father, who had been clerk of Meeting for Sufferings in 1934, in 1935 he was appointed General Secretary of Foreign Service Council, and so they moved to London. And that was the end of the Bristol story until I came back.
Wow.
But I'm very happy to take the old question.
Well, quite convoluted and many varied people who have their Roger.
I can send you all copies of the family tree if you like. Make some sense of it all. It's quite complicated.
Very good. Any questions for Roger?
My family in Ireland, on my father's side, were Quakers since the 17th century, and I think it was a great grandfather who married a good body, Roger.
Right.
Yeah, we're related to good bodies in Ireland.
Yeah, indeed. How extraordinary. But yes, I'm afraid you've reminded me something that I forgot. Important thing I forgot to say. I wanted to. The first photograph I was going to show you was of Hazel burial ground, and in the foreground is Hilda's grave, and my sister Janet is in the same grave. Her ashes are there, so that's the latest Sturge to be there. In the middle, there's a square plaque in the old style that I'm pretty sure must be Jacob, because it's the right year, 1811, and it's J with a little B S. That's all there is. But in the records, the first Joseph was buried there in 1669. So almost certainly that family were converted to Quakerism in the 1650s, when it first arrived in the Bristol area, sort of 1654, 1655, that sort of time. So, and it's all there in Hazelbury. And if you'd seen the photograph, you'd see that there are two names on the headstone and a space.
Yeah,
Keeping up the family tradition. So, any other questions?
Do you have brothers and sisters, Roger?
I do indeed. Yes, I don't have them anymore, but I had a brother, Michael, who became a professor of physics in America. He worked at Bell Lab for many years and then went into academia. My sisters, the eldest Lucy, was married to a man called John Brown, who sort of became professor of psychology in Bristol. But by that time, he and Lucy had been divorced for some time. Anne, Lucy was a research experimental physiologist. She became a specialist in electron microscopy and worked with a man who at one point was the president of the Royal Society, called Andrew Huxley, who described, first of all, the mechanism of nerve transmission. And my sister's work on the chemicals involved was part of his work. And then subsequently, he worked on the contraction of skeletal muscles. And again, my sister's work on the electron microscope was relevant to that. She had hoped to be a doctor, but she became very ill after a drug trial in 1944, when they were trying to find a good drug for malaria, and she had a very severe breakdown. So she wasn't able to go on to become a doctor. Anne worked mostly in social work and probation. She for a time was in the process for selecting people for probation officer training, but ended up as a job share on fostering and adoption in the borough of Lewisham, which was a bit embarrassing at one point because her husband got a knighthood. And when your husband gets a knighthood, you become Lady Berg in her case. And she didn't use it at work. And it turned out that our next door neighbor in Bristol also worked in Lewisham as a fostering adoption organizer in a different part of the borough at the same time. So they knew each other slightly, which was quite nice when they met up at one of my parties. John was a civil servant. He'd been a refugee from Vienna, brought over by Quakers in 1938 with his sister and his mother. Their mother was able to join them. Their father was already dead, so the immediate family survived. Obviously, distant relations didn't. John was placed at Badminton at what's the name of the school? The Quaker school in Oxfordshire. What's it called? It's still there.
Not in Reading, you're in Oxfordshire. Not Leighton Park.
No, not Leighton Park. Mixed school in it's between. It's sort of not far from Banbury. Oh, stupid. It'll come back to me. I know it well. I've been there. I even applied for the headship there once. Anyway, he went there, but left at 15 and went into a munitions factory. After the war, he studied at LSE and became the president of the student union at LSE. Was sent by the government with quite a well-known Jewish, now well-known Jewish journalist. They were sent to report to the government on the state of student life in Germany after the war. And he then went up the civil service, eventually becoming deputy secretary at the Prices and Consumer Protection. But on the way, he was the executive vice chairman of the think tank set up in the cabinet office, and he was also the first executive vice chairman of what became I think it was then called the Race Relations Board. It was certainly the beginning of the establishment of equalities quangos. So he had a very interesting career, but he then got appointed as Mrs. Thatcher appointed him. As a civil servant, he'll cut the British Council down to size. She picked the wrong man. And when he was later tipped to become the chairman of the Tate, he of course had to be first made a governor of the state, the Tate, and of course in the usual timely manner, 2 names had to go to the Prime Minister. He's not one of us, so he didn't get it. And his friend, this journalist whose name will come back to me tomorrow, wrote a very scathing piece in the Times about Mrs. Thatcher's stupidity. Anyway, he had 7 years at was it 7 years at the British Council, and developed their music and art tours, and then finished up as president of Trinity College, Oxford. My sister Janet was an art teacher, and quite an eclectic artist, worked in very many different media, and you'll see some of her stuff around my house if you come and see me. You'll be very welcome to. Anyway, sorry, I've not
your relations are many and varied, and
Very
and many, and I'm sure with most cases you could move off into these different places and have still an interesting group of people.
Yeah.
But we have reached that time, friends.
Yeah,
I'm going to have to let you all go to your different things.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Roger.
To share my
Thank
hobby.
you very much.
It was
My
a fascinating hour, Roger, and we all learned a lot, I think.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I'll test you on it next week.
But before I go, next week, as I said earlier, we are taking a break to be of the Good Friday group.
Yep.
But on April the 5th, do come and join us, for we have the development of Bristol docks.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting.
I
can't be there, unfortunately. I'll see it on record.
A chap who used to be the harbour master, called Jeff Lane.
Yeah.
So come listen and be amused as you were today.
Look forward to looking at the YouTube. I must dash. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Roger.
Bye.
Bye.